Welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Matt Tice.
And I'm Rondo Moses. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And in each episode, we try to explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast changing markets.
You'll hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are applying these mindsets to thrive in uncertain times.
If you like this content, subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Apple Podcast or Spotify. And check out our companion blogs every week at insurgentsgroup.com for a summary of takeaways from each episode. Rondo, let's get into it.
All right.
What's today's discussion about?
Well, I thought we'd talk about, insurgent cultures, how they come about, what do they look like in real life, and what incumbent organizations can do to move their organizations toward more of an insurgent culture.
All right, Rhonda, why don't you characterize that for us? Give us your give us the elevator pitch on insurgent culture. What is it? How is it different? How do I know it when I see it?
So I think insurgents cultures can be best defined by companies that appear to be punching above their weight. And what do I mean by that? They are, focused on the customer, in some cases, obsessed about the customer. Everyone has in the organization has a clear focus and understanding of that. That's where they should be targeting their energy toward. They are an organization where experimentation and learning is encouraged and rewarded. You know, failure is seen as an opportunity to learn, not as a negative in those organizations. They move fast. So these are organizations that shun bureaucracy. Their decision making is really pushed down to the front lines of the organizations where teams are empowered to make the decisions that they think are best for the customers or for the work that they're doing within their project. And there's a willingness to change. Like change is seen as inevitable for them. They're not resistant to change, so they're constantly embracing change and ability to adapt very quickly to what's happening in the market. So they have a strong external bias in that organization as opposed to an internal bias.
Well, I think we can go home now, Rondo. That's a pretty good that's a pretty good overview. I love the idea of punching above your weight, right? So, because quite often, the insurgent is obviously trying to build a culture that sort of embodies the challenger, right?
Hmm.
And typically, the challenger is, to your point, punching up or punching into some sort of established industry or trying to break an established equilibrium in an existing market or something like that, right? So in order to kind of really crack in, you got to think different, you have to be different. You can't just compete on the same ground that your kind of established competitor is competing on. So, the culture is sort of the embodiment of how you create all those things that you just described. There's a few that come to mind immediately. That sort of anti-complexity bureaucracy
Yeah.
concept. Obviously, as organizations grow and evolve, and particularly when they mature, margins start to get squeezed and revenue stops growing and things like that. It's inevitable you start looking inside and start creating, all of a sudden there's more finance people counting the beans and we try to organize for more efficiency. Somehow that bureaucracy, which is largely designed to put controls on a business um, to make sure that you're obviously using your limited resources efficiently, create that almost antithesis of the insurgent culture because, your degrees of freedom to, to pivot and change and evolve become more and more narrow. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So
Yeah.
I find that, almost no business intentionally creates a big, heavy, incumbent, sort of slow moving, inside out looking kind of bureaucratic structure. I don't think anyone does it intentionally. Of course, everyone would like to be agile and nimble, but these things evolve over, sometimes years, sometimes decades, sometimes more, to create these sort of structures and systems that are mirrored by a culture of saying no instead of saying yes. What do
Yeah.
you think?
Yeah, and I also think that there's such a focus on, to your point, the processes that are in place. This is the way that we've always done it. So in essence, the status quo, as people would say, focusing on the status quo, that there's little appetite for the new, doing things differently, finding ways to do things better and more focused on outcomes than just process. Because I think that a
Mhm.
lot of times in incumbent organizations, there's an overfocus on metrics and process as opposed to the outcome itself. And so in insurgent cultures really are focused on how do we get the outcome we want in the most efficient and effective way. And teams are allowed to be innovative in terms of how they do that. So I think that that's an important characteristic that they have as well.
Right. So it's almost like, Rondo, leadership needs to be really deliberate and intentional about what does this culture look like, right? And how
Mhm.
is it different from what I have now? Sort of what does anti-bureaucratic look like? So for example, and I just want to stay with this one for a little bit because we've talked a lot about constraints and constraints of the mind.
Mhm.
Bureaucracy is something largely under the control of a firm, right? So the leadership controls that bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy that sort of weaves its way into structures and operating models are things that can be changed. So we like controllable things that can be changed. But if we start thinking about what does anti-bureaucracy look like? So I guess on one hand, to your earlier point, how do we get closer to the customer, right? How do we reduce the time to make decisions?
Right.
How do we balance iteration and deliberation, right? So I think bureaucracy often creates a situation where too many fingers and too many pies, right? Too many people involved in decisions. Those decisions aren't decentralized to the point where that decision actually matters. Like if you're running a pizza business, the guy at the counter needs to be able to make a decision about, whether or not that individual gets pepperoni or mushrooms. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's sort of
Right.
that applies almost in every business, except for, in I think what happens is you get this gravity towards centralization and away from kind of that. So I think, each of these elements that you talked about needs almost a really granular interrogation. So again, how do we, if we know that the culture starts to, at a certain point in a firm's history, starts to look more internal than external, right?
Mhm.
How do we pick up the signals of that? Are we, for example, um, are we making our decisions through the lens of how those decisions impact customers or primarily shareholders or internal stakeholders? You know what I mean? You can see that. I actually had a great chat the other day with a client marketing director who in our 1 hour conversation stopped me 5, 6, 7 times. Hang on a minute. Let's look at this problem through the eyes of the consumer. He just kept doing it. And it was a delight to see this guy kind of stop, just kind of almost deliberately flip his thinking. Hang on a minute. Are we looking at this problem through the eyes of the consumer? And I could tell that this was a company with a culture in transition where, perhaps hadn't been that way for a while, but had started to make this shift. And it was really palpable. And when you start seeing that happen, dozens or, hundreds of times a day, lots of different people, it starts to become almost infectious.
Yeah, I have a holding company client that I work with, and one of their strategy was a roll-up strategy of other distributors in their industry. And one of the th reasons or the value that this holding company was to bring was that we can focus on, because most of these independent distributors were mom and pop type, family-owned businesses. And so the idea was if we can bring them under our umbrella, we can sort of take away some of the non-value added work that they have to do around technology and HR and sort of all the back office work, and they can focus solely on helping and providing value to the customers. And so
Mm,
we're going to optimize the back office so that these independent organizations can then focus on delivering value to the customer and really wowing the customer. So again, this was an insurgent kind of culture where they said, hey, these frontline teams need to be focused on the customer. How do we enable that? Well, we enable that by taking some of the burden away from them, from some of these technology and the data, putting in the infrastructure that they need to be most successful on the front end with customers.
mm. Okay. I think as we were talking in the preparation for this, we were sort of kicking around some ideas. One, just to stay on the notion of the customer for a second, I saw a video with Jeff Bezos from Amazon early in the development of Amazon, and I don't think I'm going to get this exactly right, Rondo, but essentially it was an interviewer sitting with Jeff in his office, and he had a really shoddy desk. I think it might have been a door on top of some filing cabinets,
Mm,
stuff everywhere. It looked like the kind of office that you would see in an auto parts sort of business in the back end of nowhere. You know what I mean? Like really not particularly nice. And the interviewer's like, Mr. Bezos, you're approaching $1 billion. You're sort of this, you're that. Amazon's really become a force in the market. Why do you have this terrible office? And you know, this has always stayed with me, right? So he sort of retorted, "Now, listen, I want to make this really clear that this is a signal to the business that we don't invest in things that don't directly impact the customer.
mm,
So my desk, my office is irrelevant to the customer. They'll never see it. They don't experience it, and it doesn't give them any joy or value. So why would we invest more in this as compared to something that matters to the customer?" So I find that really powerful. And, leaders, the mindset there is like, it applies to me, so it applies to all of us.
right.
And, to me, that's a really strong kind of insurgent touch point where, I think ultimately the challenge is not necessarily how to do that when you're really small, but the challenge is how to keep that alive as you get bigger. And, obviously the complexity comes to you. How do you do that with, it's one thing to do with 50 employees. It's another thing with 500, another again with 50,000. So I think that's really, to me, a story that sort of signals from a leader how to communicate in very simple terms that mindset and then give a very concrete example. My office doesn't impact the customer. Therefore, we're not investing in this, right? So it's almost like a little story or a narrative that almost anyone can understand. What do you think? I
Yeah, I
just think
mean,
that's
I agree. Amazon has always been to me a great example of that insurgent mindset, around the customer and being in fact, customer obsessed.
Hmm.
They leverage data in such a way to not only deliver the kinds of products and services they know that we want, but they're also constantly thinking about evolving and adding new business models to their portfolio based on having this clear understanding of the customer because they're so connected with the customer and obsessed with the customer. So I think that that is, a powerful cultural trait to have and that organizations could really learn from that. I also love, you know, Amazon is known for, I think it was in one of the shareholder reports, I can't remember if it was early on, but Jeff Bezos made the point of Amazon has to always operate as day one. And one of the characteristics of day one, operating at day one, is that you're super focused and uber focused on customers. That you are thinking about how are we going to do things differently. So you're forgetting about what you forget about what you did yesterday. What are you going to do today? What are you going to work on today that's going to be important and drive value to the customer? So that day one thinking is a part of the Amazon culture, and it's why they're so insurgent as well because they're always thinking about experimenting and learning and moving faster, all in service of the customer.
But at the same time, Amazon is constantly being challenged, right? So
Hmm.
players like Temu and others who have come in and tried to essentially copy that model and offer, you know, uh, Temu is a good example of a kind of a classic disruption where they've come in and offered a product set which is materially less expensive than Amazon and
Hmm.
has tried to sort of hollow out the bottom of Amazon, and they've gotten a lot of traction.
Right.
Um, and I don't think anyone's immune, but you can kind of imagine a Temu looking at Amazon saying, these guys are customer obsessed. We're going to be price obsessed, right?
Mm.
So it's very different, different culture, but still is still insurgent in a sense of they've just created a touchstone for them that drives their opportunity to attack, in the market that they're playing in. So I guess we always talk about offense versus defense. I think that's another really important thing in terms of, constantly being on the front foot, constantly being on the attack. And, I think it's interesting. We're seeing a lot of the economic indicators shift a little bit. Certainly here in Australia, I wouldn't say it's wobbly, but people are, kind of um, cautious, I
Yeah.
guess, right, with all the things that are happening globally and certainly here. Um, and you can see, like, you go and you speak to lots of firms and try to understand what's going on, and you can see the difference between those who look at this sort of cautious environment as now's the time to attack, and those who are now's the time to pull back. And
Right.
it's sort of like, okay, which one is the insurgent and which one's the incumbent, right? So that sort of insurgent challenger, when everyone else is zigging, we're going to zag. When everyone else is pulling back, we're going to attack. We're going to go for market share. We're going to start stealing the best salespeople from our competitors, et cetera, right? We're going to do these things to create advantage um, when that advantage might not otherwise be obvious. And I
Yeah.
think that's sort of pervasive. How do we always find a different way to do something, and a way around it, a way through it, a way over it? Um, to me is really powerful, but there are equally many forces and cultural forces in opposition. So maybe let's spend a minute on that because
Mm.
you find yourself, you might be a person who's programmed with an insurgent mindset who's dropped into a culture that's very much quite the opposite of that, Rondo.
Right.
So and you could be the CEO even in a culture that you've inherited where the board is an incumbent board. The organization has been rewarded for 20 years to be an incumbent organization. And even though, on paper, you have accountability and responsibility to drive change, it's not that easy.
Yeah, but I think in an organization like that, you have to find teams, individuals who have that kind of mindset and give them the space to explore and do things differently, whether it's a new product that's not consistent, let's say, with the your core product or your core service. They have to have somewhat of a carve out that allows them to test that new idea in the market and try to get some tractions without being encumbered by the metrics and the processes of the core business. So finding a way to create like these little incubator opportunities where people can experiment, not necessarily at the cost of impacting the larger business, but those kinds of people have an opportunity to test ideas and you get feedback and figure out where's the future opportunity going to come for this organization because your competitors are out there focusing on what was things that were desired in the past. The goal is to figure out who could be finding the future opportunities and really tapping into those. So if you have those kinds of insurgent people in your organization, I think those leaders need to find ways to give them the bandwidth that they need to experiment and to test things out and get data and feedback so that they can figure out whether it's worth investing more time or not. Like, for example, 3M, I think back in the day used to have the 15% time rule where employees got to spend 15% of their time on, personal projects. sort of within the context of work, of course, things that they wanted to experiment, test ideas, and innovate. I think more organizations need to find ways to give people that amount, that time. I think Amazon did the same thing too. Give them time.
Google had 10%.
Google had
Yeah,
10%.
yeah.
Give
I'm
them
not
time to do
convinced,
that.
Nando. I gotta be honest with you. I'm not convinced by that. I think that the theory of it sounds great, right? But what I think happens in practice is that um, a few people go off on a tangent and spend that time really effectively. Most people don't. That 10%, that 15% creates thousands of suggestions, of which only a few can necessarily be sort of implemented. And then in the end, what happens is you end up with a demotivation because that extra time isn't actually creating extra value. Now, I don't mean to sound like a cynic on this because the notion is terrific, right? The notion is terrific that we provide, as leaders, you provide more space for people to um, take time out of the daily rush and reflect, right?
Right.
Um, but the reality of it, I think, is quite different, and that's why sort of in the innovation world, uh, we had a sort of a period, let's call it between 2005 and maybe 2015, which was the just as sort of the you know, in the Web 2.0 years when, we were sort of automating everything. And a lot of these suggestion schemes on steroids came up where the idea was to hoover up all of the great ideas in the business and see if they can bubble up to the top and pick the best ones and back them and reward the employees and things like that. But the reality is that these systems became clogged with ideas. Most ideas didn't get implemented. People got disenfranchised and so forth. I think a different approach is to try to build a culture that embeds these qualities into every day, every decision. You know what I mean? So if you got a sales team on the ground trying to challenge into a market, right? Now that sales team can either do what everyone else is doing, right? And build the same relationships or whatever it is, right? Sales 101 stuff. Or they can look carefully at their competitor's sales team. They can look at the customer. They can look at the market. They can look at the data. They can look at the metrics. They can look at all of it and say, okay, maybe we don't have the resources to challenge into this market. Let's step back and think about how do we do it differently.
Yeah.
Let's think about how, in a resource constrained environment, we can do it differently.
Right.
Now, in my opinion, that mindset is all right, let's challenge out. So, like we talked about, let's be more outside looking than inside looking. Great. Um, let's be deliberate and intentional about we're going to do it differently because we don't have the resources, our historical approach hasn't gotten traction, whatever it is. And then I think it's up to leadership to not just give permission to go and do that,
Right.
right? Not say, here, go and spend 10% of your time, 15% of your time to figure out how to do it differently. It's the leadership, instead of saying, that's all great, do it differently as long as it meets these metrics or it meets these hurdle rates or whatever, is for leadership to say, that's interesting. How are we going to do it differently? Therefore, how do we need to lead differently? What resources do you need? What are the constraints that are in place, et cetera, where leadership is on the team to think about how to create that challenger sort of action in the market. And I think this applies virtually to any part of the business. If you're in marketing, if you're in HR, if you're in operations, right? The question always has to be, um, how do we move more quickly, make better decisions more quickly, and how do we allocate our resources at scale more efficiently to achieve some different outcome,
Yeah.
right? So then how do you build a culture that sort of um, embeds that into the fabric of every decision? I don't think it's a 10 or 15% thing. I think it's coming back to what you talked about at the very beginning, it's all right, we're this far from the customer. How do we get this far? All
Hmm.
right, we're resource constrained. How do we do better with less?
Yeah.
Right. And it's sort of that kind of thing. You know it when you see it. But then what typically ends up happening is, um, so I've done a lot of work in banking and fintech, for example, right? A lot of these fintech initiatives inside big banks, almost every big bank will have one, okay? Or
Hmm.
one or 10 or whatever that create these little skunk works. They try to build them up. And eventually you realize that first of all, these teams have to be separate. So now you created a separate tribe, okay, from the core. Why? For lots of reasons, right? But largely because they can't fight up the bureaucracy or the culture or whatever,
Right.
so they have to be separated. So these teams get created, and then maybe even they get funded, and then they develop, and eventually they reach the conversation where they've got a solution. Maybe even the market really wants this solution, but inevitably that solution will challenge in the form of, let's say, cannibalizing the bank or the institution's current products and services, maybe, or more likely at the early stages, that sort of investment won't meet the metrics that the rest of the bank is being held accountable for, and it will be killed after, you know, I don't know, could be millions or
Right.
tens of thousands of hours or whatever it is of effort. It'll be killed, and it was never going to be successful, right? Um, because you don't have that broad-based acceptance of um, how do we constantly keep challenging. And we always talk about in the world of insurgents of almost the number one rule of disruption is thou shalt not self-cannibalize, right? So nobody ever wants to give an inch, but they're always happy to let their competition, cannibalize them or take their market share or whatever. I always find that really interesting. So I think it's much more complicated than just setting aside the time. I think it has to be almost total systemic culture design to make sure that every individual in the organization understands um, how to punch up, how to punch out, how not punch out, but you know what I mean, how
I
to
know what you mean.
connect customers, et cetera. And it's a much more difficult, much more nuanced, and much more challenging sort of shift to make, particularly if you're already the incumbent. And you almost certainly won't make that change unless your back's against the wall.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, but I want to go a different direction. I think it's like there's a yes and, right? So I
We
do
don't have to agree on everything,
No,
Rondo.
I do believe that there is a an opportunity for people to make for organizations to make this so that it's sort of people see this as the way that they work, right? They're constantly looking for, new ways to do things, more effective ways to do things. But I see that as a part of their job. But the idea here in an insurgent culture where you want to find that new white space or new products that are not being delivered by your competitors, I think that involves thinking beyond just the day-to-day stuff, which might mean that you're going to work with, you might find a few like-minded folks in the organization who are outside your functional area, and you work together on a project. And so people need that flexibility to do that. And I think that kind of, teaming up together and working together can be fostered if people had the flexibility in their schedule to say, hey, I've got this project and I think this engineer over in this corner, of the company would be great. I think I read a story about someone was given a challenge. I think it was a junior person was given a challenge to make a change in how something was done inside the organization, a process, or I believe it was a process inside the organization. And he said, "Hey, if I could work with a couple of engineers in the company, I could get it done, fairly quickly." And the CEO was like, "Hey, do what you have to do." The guy literally found the engineers that he thought would be the specialists to be able to do this work, took them out for a beer, and the next morning they were on flights to some other part of the country or the globe, actually, where they knew that they could develop this work and they developed this new product. for the company. It's like that kind of thinking where you're not sort of constricting people to just focusing on the innovation for your specific area, but you're thinking about how do I create value for the larger company even beyond my current role? And that may involve working with people that you don't work with on a day-to-day basis. So there's both. It's like how do I
Yeah. We're not disagreeing because I
right,
think fundamentally what you've just described is a situation where the leader said, "What can I do to help?" Right?
right,
So that's, so the signal is, all right, you have conviction about this. You've
right,
sort of laid out, you need these things. Here's the opportunity. Now let me get out of the way and then give you what you need to do that. But that's different, I think, Rondo, than that sort of blanket 10%. Everyone gets 10% to navel gaze or think about the future or whatever it is. I think that's more, and I think that's more what we're talking about here is like how do we reduce the friction to make faster decisions, to get
right,
products to market more quickly, to get closer to the customer, all these things. It's kind of like that culture of motion, right?
right,
That culture of flat hierarchical structures, right? CEO becomes the orchestrator, the conductor, as opposed to the controller, right? In this
yeah,
case that you described, which is terrific, right? Young person comes, I've got this concept, this idea, I need these things, I need you to connect with me with these people. Okay, great. And then also I think the story is a great one in a sense that you describe something that isn't, yeah, they didn't meet in a conference room. They met in the pub, right?
right,
It's
right,
very different.
right,
They they probably didn't sketch it on the whiteboard. They sketched it on the napkin.
right,
All of these things become these palpable kind of experiences that then they can tell stories about later. You know what
right.
I mean? I was really worried. I went in to talk to the boss. Um, the boss was really open. He said, "That's great. Come on in. Let's talk about it." And I thought I'd never get the resources. Next thing you know, I'm on a plane. We're in the pub, right? Then when this thing comes to life, that becomes a story that then can get broadcast to lots of other people who
Right.
then will be encouraged to experience their version of that story. And then you have this sort of cultural virus, which the positive kind, right? Which then creates, almost this um, permission to innovate, permission to play, permission to change, to punch up, to punch out.
Yeah. I worked with a nonprofit education organization that what they did was they created an innovation fund where groups of teachers could get, $1,000. I think that was the number, 1,000 or maybe it was $2,000 to do. They had to put together a little small write-up of what the project is that they wanted to work on, but they could get $1,000 to try that. And so you create a pool of money that would be for these kind of innovative ideas that people want to test. And you give people an opportunity to try things at a low budget, you know, no strings attached, but just here's you got $1,000 and you can sort of create a proof case, for this idea that then if people see it's worthwhile, then that sort of takes you to the next stage and you can get probably more money. But there's an opportunity for you to not feel totally resource constrained because you can get some funding to help you sort of create an MVP of some sort for that particular idea that you want to get done. That's another way that organizations can create that culture. So, hey, we've got this innovation pool for people who want to try new ideas and create new ideas. If you submit your idea, you have an opportunity to win $1,000 to create an MVP for that idea. Like, so that kind of, I
Did it
think,
work?
yeah, in this organization, yeah. Yeah,
Right.
because what they were doing was innovating within the context of, education, but also the back office of this nonprofit organization as well.
So again, not to be contrarian here.
Incremental.
Yeah, I'm deeply skeptical about that, right? So I see that almost in the exact same category as that 10%. That's now here's the $1,000, right?
Right.
It's this idea that we're going to reward people to do the things that we want them to do. Um, and I don't disagree at all with the idea of providing incentives, right? But I think that's a band-aid over a culture potentially that isn't um, dynamic and kind of isn't a challenger or insurgent culture. I think um, it's a way to get people who we've rewarded to do one thing for a long time to do something else,
True.
which ends up happening largely on the margin. I think I also have a not for profit experience recently, which I think would be we don't have $1,000 to give people, right? So and it's sort of like the culture that we've tried to build is we literally have no resources. Now, how do we cobble together capability, time, whatever it is, products, resources in novel ways to create new value for our stakeholders? You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
recently we had this fellow, and I won't call him out by name, but he'll know who he is if he listens to this, right? Who had this very tenacious view of how he wanted to architect this part of our tech stack, right? And you know, nobody really understood what he was talking about, but it was very bottom up in a sense of the decisions had to be made at the board, but the change had to be bottom up, and essentially the rather than telling him what to do, the board and the leadership team just basically said, "We trust you. Go for it. Create this and then show us how it's better for the customer or our beneficiary. Show
Hmm.
us how it's better for the organization. Show us how." And basically that process, probably our big learning was it took a long time to get there, but it was completely bottom up and organic, right? And
Mm.
it wasn't incentivized. It was more the individual had strong convictions and the culture was okay, go for it. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
And I don't know. I guess I hear you, but my feeling is at some level, the culture always tries to regress to the mean in a sense that, you know what I mean? If you don't create um, and then consistently reinforce these behaviors. Just coming back to the Jeff Bezos story, how do we get closer to the customer? Does everything that we do provide meaningful value to our customer, our consumer, whatever? And that's just one example. There could be lots of others. Or how do we make decisions much more quickly? Or whatever the thing is that you're really trying to accomplish to allow you to, you know, zig when everyone else is zagging. If you don't deeply embed those and syndicate them across your business, um, and rather instead you try to challenge from the edges, I think what happens is the best case you end up with two cultures,
Mm.
one which is this core, and two is on the fringe, and inevitably they come into conflict, which is problematic, right? Or worst case, um, you disenfranchise a whole group of people because, like I described before with the fintech example, these $1,000 incubator ideas finally make it up to the board and get killed because, you know, they don't meet the standards that the rest of the business is held to. I find that deeply problematic, right? In a sense of, I think the challenge for leadership is to build kind of almost the thematic that's really all about this
Right.
is what we stand for, and then be able to communicate that thematic in a way that's very approachable to people, and then reinforce that at every minute with every decision in every meeting. You know what I mean? So
Right.
I'd rather, it's almost like, hey, we're all a bunch of old men sitting around this same table having this same conversation. Let's go and get the young people who are working with our customers into this discussion,
Right.
right? Or we're all sitting around this whiteboard. Let's go to the pub and let's change it up. Let's look at the problem differently. You know what I mean? It's like I think it's 1,000 things
Yeah.
all happen together around a particular theme.
But
Like you want to be,
imagine creating those
all of
themes. Imagine
yeah,
creating those themes at the leadership level, communicating
yeah,
those themes consistently across the organization that here's where we'd like to see innovation. Here's where we'd like to win, in these
yeah,
buckets. And saying we're creating incentive for people to think about ideas in these buckets. So, there is money for those who want to try and test things and learn. Like what if you had that
yeah, yeah.
structure?
No, I agree with you. Like being
Okay.
able to funnel resources to things that are going to turn the dial.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
I guess I'm less attracted to the idea of providing a bounty. You know what I mean? Um, Bounty either in terms of time or in money, right? I would much rather have a culture where those individuals are freed up to see the opportunity, look at it through a different lens, and then, feel like they can marshal that through a system that will allow those opportunities to grow or die in a very low friction environment. I
Mm,
guess to me that feels much better, right? And then the second thing is leadership at all levels, not just senior leadership,
right.
leadership at all levels, sort of visibly demonstrating that culture, just like the Amazon example. You know what I mean? I think that's absolutely essential. Let's get out of this office. Let's go down to the distributor and let's go talk to, the board, the leadership team. Let's go talk to the customer. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
Um, those kind of visible signals. I think, the old example, the FedEx guy who drove through the snowstorm in the middle of the night to get the wedding dress to,
Right.
somebody. It's sort of like that story is something that goes on for decades. Like,
Yeah.
what is it like to be here? This is an obsessed kind of business. Um, and from that point of view, I think unless you have that, it's really hard to, be to create the insurgent culture. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Because it just has to touch almost everything. When
So
you're looking
so
at metrics like this investment versus that investment, this investment over here doesn't get the same metrics as this investment over here.
right.
Insurgent organizations get that.
They know
The
that.
incumbents want everything to have the same metric. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
It's just right. It's granular, Rondo, I think.
So if there's one thing we could communicate to incumbent organizations and incumbent and leaders in incumbent organizations who really want to create more of an insurgent culture, what's the one thing that they could do to move them along that journey?
Yeah, I wish there was one thing, Rondo. I'd say to me, um, the signal touchstone of the insurgent is like a relentless focus on the market and the consumer, right?
Mhm.
So the theory of zero distance to the customer, and then how does that then pervade everything that we do? But you can still have that sort of mindset and not be an insurgent, right? So like Toyota, I think is an incumbent. They probably operate like an incumbent, and they're pretty compared to their peers, they're pretty focused on providing products and services in lots of categories that meet customer needs. But I would categorize them not particularly insurgent like. So I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's necessary, but not sufficient. But that'd be my one thing. Like, if you want to start on this journey, start looking at the business from the outside in, not from the inside out, and see where that takes you. But there's so much more to it than that.
Right. Right. Because for
What
me,
about you?
I agree with that. I was gonna say I would say that as well. But I also do think, another aspect would be how do you foster a culture of experimentation and learning? Like what can you do to give people the opportunity to make smart risks, take smart risks inside the organization within maybe some of the confines of the key themes that you want to excel at as an organization over the long term, but really communicate to people that taking smart risks is welcomed inside your organization and learning from, mistakes. I think that that's another healthy way to move your organization toward more of an insurgent culture.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think maybe the thing that links those two ideas together is like, how do we reduce the friction, right? So reduce the friction in decision making, reduce the friction in getting value to the customer, reduce the friction in getting opportunities from concept to market. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's sort of like flatter structures, less friction, more ability to combine talent, and then bring it together, blow it apart, recombine it in lots of different ways. I think there's something really there in terms of a culture that's kind of constantly mobilized as compared to reaches sort of like a static equilibrium.
Right, right. A culture that can adapt, right?
Ultimately, that's the key, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Very interesting, Rondo. We're going to need to get some case studies in here to sort of build on this a little bit more. And I've got some ideas around some leaders and perhaps some other, some other thinkers in this area that really specialize in this that we should bring onto the podcast and develop this into a bit of a series because I think it's
Yeah.
really important. They say culture eats strategy for breakfast. I probably don't really fully agree with that, but there's certainly two sides of a coin, and being able to kind of sustain that change is essential. Mm,
I saw a twist on that. A culture eats disruption for breakfast. Really.
right. Okay. Well, there's a lot of there's a lot of breakfast meals out there. I guess
Right.
fundamentally these things are all intertwined, and I don't think there isn't a dominant gene. But one thing is absolutely for sure is that an insurgent culture um, has to be deliberately developed and nurtured and evolved. And unfortunately, the incumbent culture develops by itself
Right.
in many ways. It's not created. It's almost like a death of a thousand cuts. It's an evolution of growth and maturity and things that, almost an inevitability. So you have to fight really hard against it. And
Yeah.
some ways that insurgent culture is the underdog. And I guess to your point at the very beginning, kind of closing the circle, punching above your weight requires an underdog mindset.
Right.
And I really think that's where we have to be.
Yeah, I agree. The challenger mindset is where organizations need to be thinking about.
Hmm. All right. Well, great discussion, Rondo. Thanks. And it's nice to see us sort of disagreeing on a few things. I enjoy
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, then. Have a good weekend ahead. All the
You too,
best. And
Matt.
just a reminder to subscribe on your favorite podcast, particularly Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.